You preachers never talk about anything that relates to my world. That's what he said to me as he exited the church, people shaking hands into the service. He said, "Why don't you ever talk about things that I can actually put to use in my world?" And I responded, "Now, where did you ever get the notion that the purpose of a sermon was to speak to your world? I want to rock your world, okay?" Now, I tell you that story not only to warn you, if any of you are thinking about criticizing my preaching, but also in that exchange, it's interesting. You got two people, and they're both asking questions of one another. But behind each of those questions is an assumptive world. Behind each of those questions is a worldview. What is a sermon? What is the purpose of preaching? And behind every question anybody asks, there is always an assumed world that stands behind that question. We were in a group a few years ago, and the group was discussing the so-called affordable health care plan. And there was a speaker, and the speaker put before the group a number of questions. Are you happy with your current health care provider? Do you not want to choose who will administer medical help to you? Do you want the government involved in your medical treatment? Are you really wanting to change a system that's already functioning quite well? Well, then the group discussed those questions. But during the discussion, a woman who was a public health nurse spoke up and said, "You know, I don't understand your questions in this particular group. This is a Christian group. The right question is not, are you happy with your current health care provider? The question is your neighbor receiving the health care she needs?" That's the question we're supposed to ask. And right there in that moment, you see a collision of two different assumptive worlds. What is the real question that should be asked in that context? I can tell you as a teacher, teachers learn that one of the toughest tasks of being a teacher is asking the right questions on exams. A Duke student was telling me that he was taking a course, I guess it was in astronomy or something like that, because he said that one of the questions on the exam was, name 3 things that happen on the earth but never happen on the moon. And I'm sure when the professor asked that question, the professor was thinking of various physical properties or chemical exchanges or something like that. The student said he responded, 3 things that happen on the earth that don't happen on the moon. 1, Justin Bieber. 2, roller skates. And 3, French fries. Behind every question is an assumption. Now, what are appropriate questions to ask about the world? What kind of world do you think we live in? In today's gospel, as you heard, Jesus is examined by his critics. Jesus is asked some questions. Now, his critics, the Sadducees, they probably don't really want answers to their questions. They are mainly hoping to come up with a question so wild and so complex that Jesus, whatever answer he gives, will make Jesus appear foolish. The Sadducees, whom Luke reminds us, do not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, a party within Judaism in that day, that were conservative. They denied this newfangled idea of the general resurrection of the dead. They come to Jesus and they pose a trick question. Jesus, in this so-called resurrection of the dead, say here's a woman and she marries a man and he dies without children, without that issue. So Levitical law says that the man's brother will, out of responsibility, will now marry the woman, and so they did that. But then this brother died and there were no children. And so then the third brother marries her and there are no children. On and on, 7 marriages, 7 funerals, still no children. Okay, Jesus, here's the question. Whose wife would she be if there were a resurrection of the dead? Now notice this discussion, this theological, biblical discussion going on here. Can you imagine being that woman listening in on this conversation? Here's a woman that's had one of the saddest lives one could imagine. 7 weddings, 7 funerals. She's standing there as they debate about Moses and the law. No concern for the woman. Furthermore, note the assumptive world behind the Sadducees' comments. Now, what is the purpose of marriage? Well, to make this woman the property of her husband. Now, she's been the property of one husband, and then he died, and then she has another husband, and he's transferred property to his brother, and on through that. Now, whose wife will she be property of in the resurrection? They could have been talking about a piece of livestock and not a human being. She's been the property. She's a woman. She's got to be the property of some man. Now, in the resurrection, whose property will she rightly be? And Jesus responds, in this world, you have these arrangements. Moses made these arrangements to ensure, in a humane way, for the survival of single women who had no one to protect and to provide in this patriarchal culture. But in the world to come, there won't be the same arrangements. In this world, you have a world of death and tragedy and injustice. In this world, you have it where men and women are conflicted and social arrangements in which people suffer. But in the world to come, that world is not the world you have produced. That world is the world God produces. The world to come is not so much that world that you assume you deserve. It is the world that God deserves. And how hard this is to kind of get in our brains. Because I know you're mainline liberal Protestant types. And all this talk about the next world, the world to come, you're conditioned to think, oh yeah, this is pie in the sky, by and by, escapism. This is what some of these conservative churches talk about when they're always talking about, we're just here, one day I'll fly away and all that. Jesus here draws the sharpest distinction possible between this world, our world, and the world to come. The Cambridge classicist E.I. Hare said, the 20th century, the bloodiest century the world has ever known, if you just count up the number of bodies, most of whom were killed by their own governments. He said the 20th century began when somebody had the notion that this world is all there is and can be. And that paved the way, he said, for everything else that happened in the bloody 20th century. The century and its wars and rumors of wars that Bob Cox could tell us about. The assumption that this world, for any of its faults, this is it. What you see, that's what you get. This is it. This world. And we've been kind of conditioned, mainline liberal Protestantism, to think that that's kind of what church is. Church is to help you get along in this world. The preacher's job is to help you, give you some helpful hints for homemakers that will help you kind of get along next week and work the world as it is a little better to your advantage. But Jesus here makes the starkest contrast between this world, for any of its strengths and glories, this world and the world to come. Do not make the fatal assumption that just because there have been these arrangements and these class distinctions and these economic inequities here, that shall apply in the world to come. Why do you come to church? May I suggest to you this morning, one of the reasons you come to church is to give you, when we're doing our best, just a glimpse of that world to come, that is God getting God's will done in heaven as it is on earth. Thy kingdom come. What is the mission statement of this congregation, Duke Memorial? Duke Memorial Church exists, according to our mission statement, to be a sign and a foretaste of God's kingdom in downtown Durham. We're here not simply to help downtown Durham work a little more efficiently. We're here to sign and to signal a world that is not yet here. A world that is not, but by God's grace one day shall be. That's my theory for why we've got these psychedelic windows that are surrounding us. That's not my phrase. It was a phrase of a young congregation that's checking us out, possibility of meeting here for worship. They walked in and they said, wow, this is psychedelic. And what a beautiful Sunday morning for the colors. Those of you who are not from the 60s don't even know what that word means. But and it is kind of amazing. We had a medical student visit this fall, and he is Syrian Orthodox. And he walked in here and said, wow, this is an Orthodox church. Look at all the icons. Now, what an explanation for those windows is, well, the world is so ugly out there. You come in here, and isn't it beautiful with these beautiful colors and the sunlight streaming in? And this church is where we view the world through rose-colored glasses. And you look at these windows, and they're depicting people, but they seem to be people in some other world. Oh, yeah, that's you Christians. Church is where you come to escape the grubby realities of the present and dream about some world in the by and by. Okay, that's one explanation. But maybe another explanation, based on another set of assumptions, is that world out there is not the world as God intended. It is not the finished product of God's creativity. And that we gather here on a weekly basis to dare to look at the world that is coming. Sunday morning is when we dare to risk the friction that occurs when this world comes into collision with the world to come. When we hope to get our imagination stoked and fueled and funded concerning the possibility of God's continuing creativity. Call it escapist if you want to. But from what I've seen, some of the most dedicated, hardest working people for the betterment of this world are those that sit on this world rather lightly. Those that can look at a homeless family, such as will be occupying our church next week after next, and look upon that homeless family and not say to them, well, you know, this is the best we can do, and you're lucky to be functioning in such a well-working economy and in a democracy. No, they look upon that homeless family and by their deeds, in a sense, whisper to them, there's another world. And you help us to get a glimpse of that world. That's also Sunday morning. What are the questions we ask? When we come to church, we come and say, oh, I wonder what I need to do next week to get my life a little better aligned with with God's goodness. What can we do to make this life a little less miserable for a few people and all? Maybe we come here to just get reminded that our actions are not the only actions going on in downtown Durham. That God is also busy. And thus we dare to pray, thy kingdom come and thy will be done in downtown Durham as it one day shall be done forever in the next. Church becomes therefore a serious, bold attempt to resist the lure of the status quo and the lie that modernity would press upon us that says, hey, stop your whining. This is as good as it gets. This is all you should expect of life. You've been the victim of tragedy and injustice. Well, put a smile on your face, endure it with stoic resignation. That's a bit. No, church is where we come to say, in this world, yes, but in the next. One of my first churches in Greenville, South Carolina, I was buddies with a fellow pastor who served a church in one of the toughest parts of that city. And we did a pulpit swap. He came and preached in our church, and I went and preached in his church. I asked him, I said, now what time does your church start? He said, oh, we start about 11. I got there at 20 of 11, and my car was the first car in the parking lot. The pastor arrived about 5 after 11, and the choir got assembled about 10 after 11. Then ensued 5 hymns, 2 anthems, and 2 offerings, 2 collections. I didn't stand up to preach till about 12:30. So I preached a tasteful 15-minute maybe sermon. And then I sat down and my friend stood up and said, that's it? And I said, yeah, that's it. And he said, let me just add a few things here. Then he preached another 15-minute sermon. We weren't standing out in the parking lot afterwards until 1:45 in the afternoon. And I said to my friend, hey, I'd had about 6 cups of coffee to get ready for this. I was up there dying. And I said, how come you take so long to worship on Sunday morning? I mean, what is that? I could never get my people to sit that long. And he said with a smile, why do my people take so long to worship? I think it's because in this neighborhood, male unemployment is running at 18%. Young adult unemployment is at 21%. So that means when my people get out of this church and get back on the street, everything this culture says to them says, you don't have a good car. You're nothing. You don't have a great clothes. You're nobody. So what I try to do is on a weekly basis, I get them in here in the church, and then through the hymns and the anthems and the prayers and the preaching, I try to say to them, that is a lie. Don't you believe it? You people are royalty. You have been bought with a price. God has got plans for you. God needs you and owns you. And he says, it takes me about an hour and 45 minutes to get their head straight. Now, how long does it take your people to get their head straight in your neighborhood? Thanks be to God.
Because he's given